friends, welcome back to Homegrown Florida. I'm Patrina and I had an amazing plum harvest this last year. This little tree right here in a pot had so many beautiful Gulf Rose plums on them, and I was trying to figure out what am I going to do with all of these little amazing sweet tart plums. I knew I wanted to preserve them in some way because it was just more than we could eat from this tree. Plus, I have a whole nother tree. So it was too much all at once. And I knew I wanted to preserve them, but most of the recipes I had seen was for like a plum jam, like an Asian plum jam sauce. And I just didn't feel like we would use it that much, or whole plums canned. And then I found a plum jam recipe and I thought to myself, I don't think I've ever seen plum jam in the store. And so I went to my local store and believe it or not, they do not have plum jam. And I thought to myself, why isn't there plum jam at the store? Like, what does it taste like? I was very hesitant to try to make this plum jam because I've never tasted it before. I didn't know if it was going to be like a waste of my plums. Maybe it's terrible. Maybe that's why it's not in the stores. But I took a chance and I was like, you know what? It seems like it's going to be the best recipe, so I'm going to make plum jam with the plums that I grew in my small backyard garden. Now, I harvested these in spring and I just didn't have the time to deal with them. There was a lot of stuff going on in the garden, so I just cut them and took the pit out and stuck them in a freezer bag and stuck them in the freezer until I had some time. And today is that day. Today I have time. So I let them defrost for a few hours and then I took them out and I put them in a pot on my stove. I need to start breaking these down a little bit because they are chunky. You could use an immersion blender to break them down, but I actually like having chunks of fruit in my jam as opposed to a smoother jam. But you could totally use a blender or an immersion blender. All I used was a potato masher to kind of break them up just a little bit because I still wanted pieces. Strangely enough, if you've been into canning for a while, you know that a lot of the times they tell you to take the skin off of the fruit. But this recipe didn't call for that. This recipe that I'm using is the National Center for Home Food Preservation's recipe, and I'm using Sure Gel's pectin. You don't have to use pectin. There's actually a recipe on the same website that has a non-pectin, but I kind of wanted this to go quickly, and I really like my jams to set up very, very thick. So I don't like to have a runny jam at all, which is why I tend to lean into using pectin. But you could just boil this for a longer period of time, and it will have the natural pectins in the fruit thicken it up over time. So the first thing I did was, after I crushed up all the fruit and I got it to a boil, I added the Sure Gel pectin. Now I'm going to scare you a little bit here in a moment. I'm about to put the sugar in. Sure Gel pectin requires that you put in a pretty significant amount of sugar. Now, I probably could have gone with less. I think I actually did go with less. The recipe called for 8. I ended up doing 7 cups, which is crazy because it's like 6 cups of fruit and 7 cups of sugar. Now, if you used a different pectin like Pomona's pectin, you could use it all or none of the sugar. You could go with a sugar alternative like stevia. You could just do the fruit with no sugar. Like, there are options if you're using Pomona pectin, but when you're using Sure Gel and you want it to actually set up and thicken like a jam is supposed to, you do have to use a decent amount of sugar. Now, like I said, I used a cup less, and I think next time I'm going to use an equal amount. So 6 cups fruit, 6 cups sugar. Once I brought it back to a boil after putting the sugar in, I cooked it for 1 minute at that full rolling boil, which is what's necessary to achieve that thickness. And then I pulled it off the heat and let it cool down for just a second, maybe 3 minutes. I got my jars sterilized, cleaned, and I started pouring the jam into the jars. Now, the recipe calls for, I think, half-pint jars. I didn't have any half-pints, but I had a ton, and I mean a ton of quarter-pint jars. So I thought I'll just put them in quarter-pint jars, which works out for me. It means that we're going to eat them less because there's a lesser amount in the jar, and I can use up some of these jars with something that we don't eat a lot of all at once, and it's not going to just clutter up the refrigerator. At this point, I still had not even tried this jam, and I'm putting 20 jars of this stuff into my pantry. So after I got these jars filled up, I decided, you know what, let me taste it because this is a lot of jars to have on my shelf and not know if I like it. And y'all, I'm speechless. Like the words are having a hard time coming out how good plum jam is. If you have never had it before, it beats them all. And I'm a big jam fan, right? I eat them all. Fig, strawberry, raspberry, blackberry. I do the mixed berries. I did a strawberry banana jam that I canned that was exceptional. I did a pineapple tomatillo jam. I am a jam connoisseur, and I say this with my whole chest. This is by far the very best jam that I have ever made, and it's so simple. It's just fruit and sugar. There's no like mixing ingredients or anything. Something about the sweetness of the plum mixed with like the tartness of a plum, and then you have like this sourness to the skins that are in there, and it's I'm speechless, guys. It's hard to explain because it is just so good, and I want to put it on absolutely everything in my house. And all I can think about is I really hope that the trees produce even more plums next year because I have a feeling that we're going to go through these 20 jars before the year is even out, which is insane. I definitely need to work on a recipe with a lot less sugar so I don't feel so terrible about this. Now, the next step in canning, if you haven't water bath canned before, is to clean off the lids or the rims here. I'm taking some white distilled vinegar on a paper towel or a tea towel, and I'm just wiping off the rims where the lids are going to go on because they get really sticky from jam. We're talking about a lot of sugar here. Even if it wasn't a lot of sugar, the fruit itself will cause a lot of sugar to build up on that rim, and it will cause a failed seal. I actually ended up having two that failed because of this, and I had to reprocess them. So really take your time with this step and make sure that you're getting off all of that jam off of those edges so that you don't have to process these jars twice. Who wants to do that? Who's got time to do that? So once I got them all cleaned up, I'm going to add fresh lids and bands to the jars, and then I'm going to process them in my water bath canner for 10 minutes. I sometimes use a pot to do this because that is possible water bath canning, especially with a jar so small as a quarter pint. You could just put them in a pot that's short enough, right? As long as there's something in the bottom of the pot so that way they're not touching the bottom of the pot because that'll cause them to crack and break. You could put anything down there, like a towel, a wet towel into the water would work as well. And then you're going to submerge them in that water. But today I'm using my Presto electric pressure canner. If you're new to canning, or maybe you haven't started canning yet because you're kind of scared, I have to tell you that the Presto electric pressure canner takes all the fear out of it. If you're familiar with an Instapot, it basically works like an Instapot, but for canning. You don't cook food in these types of canners. These are for water bath and pressure canning food, for sterilizing the jars and processing the jars, whether you're doing it water bath or pressure canning. Today we're doing water bathing. So depending on which one you're doing will depend on which instructions you follow on the machine. They come with like a single card. One side of the card shows you how to do water bath canning and the other side shows you how to do pressure canning, and it is the simplest way. I used to use a manual canner, and those are great, and I do still have one, but the one that I had before broke. And at that time, I was like, I think I'm going to get a Presto electric canner because who wants to sit there and monitor your canner, especially the pressure canner side, to make sure that you're staying within pressure when they have these machines now that do it for you. I literally can like go to the store and it's like having a crock pot or having an Instapot running and you're not having that fear. So it takes all the fear out of it. And then it just tells you when it's done. It cools down by itself, and it's pretty much just you can't make a mistake with this guy. And if you do, it tells you. You could, of course, go with a manual canner. I used one of those for years. I still have one of those. I bought another one after my original one had broken. That's a whole nother story. How I could manage to break a manual canner is beyond me, but I'm really good at breaking stuff, so I guess that is on brand. But I did pick up another one, and I have to tell you, I've never used it. It is still in the box because I just always use the Presto canner. We got these guys out, and like I mentioned, two of them didn't seal. I didn't know this until a little bit later. When you first pull them out, a lot of them, the buttons are still up. If you're not familiar with how to tell if a jar is canned properly or sealed properly, is that there'll be a little button in the center that goes up and down. You can almost see it in this very front one where it's just kind of concave. And that little button, as it sits and cools down, it basically vacuums out the air from inside the jar and it sucks and seals the jar down flat. So the button in the center is an easy way to tell whether or not it's sealed. Another way that I like to do it is I will pull these rings off and I will hold the jar by just the lid to make sure that it would not come off that way. And then there's a third way that I do, and I do it every single time now. And if you don't do this, I really strongly encourage you, because the two jars in this batch passed both of those tests. The button was down. I was able to pick it up and lift it by just the seal, but they were not sealed properly. And that little trick is to take the back of a spoon and tap it on the jars. Take the rings off like I'm doing here and tap that spoon on the top of the jars. And as you're tapping, you're going to hear different sounds. The ones that are sealed have a ping, a high-pitched ping sound, and the ones that didn't seal properly have a dull thunk. You'll very clearly hear the difference when you have one that didn't seal. So I had 18 that sealed perfectly with the high-pitched ping, and then I had 2 with the dull. And once I hit that dull, I was like, something's not right here. And so I kind of just started to fiddle with the lid a little bit, like trying to get it off, and it unsealed immediately. It was so quick. It popped right off, but it didn't, I could still hold it by the lid and it didn't pop off. I really had to kind of fidget with it and it did pop off, but that would have been something that would have popped off later on, which is one of the reasons why I always take my rings off, because it can look, feel, and sound like it's sealed properly, and it's not going to display the elements that it is not sealed properly until it starts to ferment or go bad. And at that point, then the seal will pop off, the lid will pop off, and it will give off a bad smell, it'll have mold, all the terrible things, right? But if the ring is still on it, it will burst open and then reseal sometimes, or the glass will actually break, crack, and in a small way explode. And that puts jam everywhere, and who wants that? If you just take the rings off and the pressure builds, and because it didn't seal properly, just the lid's going to pop off and allow the gas to escape. And yeah, it's going to smell awful and you're going to have this moldy, contents to the jar, but it's not going to get everywhere. It's going to be very easy to identify. You're going to see it. But with those rings on, you don't always see it. So I hope that helps, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Happy preserving!